When most people think of World War II, they picture massive battles, advancing armies, and historical turning points, but rarely do they stop to consider the small villages that got caught in the crossfire. Polon, a quiet French village, seemed like just another dot on the map, a place where life had continued peacefully even as the war raged elsewhere. And yet, what the Germans did there was something that no one expected. It wasn't just about occupation or control, it was about shock, intimidation, and a brutal demonstration of power that would leave a mark on every survivor. The villagers had no warning, no strategic value to offer, yet suddenly their lives were thrown into chaos, and the ordinary streets they had walked for generations became scenes of fear and devastation. The story of Polon is a reminder that the horrors of war are not always found on battlefields. The soldiers didn't just march through, they imposed themselves in ways that were entirely unanticipated. Houses were searched with an almost clinical precision, doors were broken down, and personal belongings were rifled through as though the village itself had committed some unforgivable crime. Families were torn from their homes, often with little explanation, and forced to witness acts of violence that would haunt them forever. What made it so shocking wasn't just the destruction itself, it was the randomness, the way a place that had known only peace could suddenly be turned into a scene of terror. For the villagers, it was a complete inversion of what they had thought they understood about the war. Even before the soldiers arrived, life in Poland had been routine, defined by simple rhythms: children going to school, farmers tending to their fields, neighbors greeting each other on cobblestone streets. Then came the sudden intrusion of armed forces, and the illusion of normalcy vanished in an instant. People who had lived alongside each other for decades found themselves thrown into suspicion, fear, and helplessness. Neighbors were forced to watch as others were singled out for questioning, humiliation, or worse. It was not a calculated military maneuver aimed at winning a battle, it was a display of sheer intimidation, a way to communicate a terrifying message: no one, not even a small, seemingly inconsequential village, was safe from the machinery of war. What makes the events in Poland particularly jarring is how they defy expectations. France had already endured invasions, skirmishes, and occupations, but the scale and immediacy of the Germans' actions here went beyond what people had imagined. The villagers weren't hardened combatants, they were civilians, living ordinary lives. Yet they were confronted with the full force of a military power that seemed to operate without rules. The horror was amplified by the unexpectedness: there was no warning, no chance to prepare, and no logic that could explain why this quiet village was targeted in such a way. The randomness of it made every family, every street corner, and every daily routine feel vulnerable, as though nothing could ever return to the way it had been. And then there were the stories that came out afterward, the whispered recollections of survival, the memory of neighbors helping each other, and the resilience that somehow persisted despite everything. Even in the face of such brutality, the people of Poland clung to fragments of normal life. They hid children, shared what little food they had, and tried to maintain some sense of community. That resilience, however, doesn't lessen the shock, it highlights just how far ordinary people were pushed into the unimaginable. The Germans' actions weren't just an attack on a village, they were an attack on the very idea that ordinary life could continue in wartime. Poland's story is a sobering reminder that World War II wasn't only fought in grand battles or historic cities. Sometimes, the most harrowing moments occurred in small, overlooked places, and what happened there challenges our assumptions about war and its impact on civilians. The events in this village were unexpected in every sense, unexpected in timing, in severity, and in their lasting emotional toll. And it's precisely this element of shock, the fact that ordinary people were subjected to unimaginable cruelty, that makes Poland a story that demands to be remembered, a testament to both the horrors of war and the resilience of those who survive it. Amid the chaos and shock of what the Germans did in Poland, it's easy to get lost in numbers, dates, and military strategies, but the real story, the story that stays with you, is the human one. The villagers themselves were at the heart of it, living through moments that most of us could scarcely imagine. For them, the war wasn't something distant, fought somewhere else on maps or in news reports, it was immediate, personal, and terrifying. Mothers held their children close, fathers tried to hide their fear behind quiet determination, and neighbors clung to one another for support. Every small act of survival became a story of courage in a place that had been ordinary only days before. Children, in particular, were caught in a world that suddenly made no sense. One day they were running through the village square, playing tag, or going to school with their friends. The next, the sound of boots on cobblestones, the shouting of strangers in uniforms, and the sudden disappearance of neighbors became their new reality. Some were hidden by desperate parents, tucked under floorboards or in haylofts, trembling in silence as soldiers stormed the homes around them. Others were forced to witness events that no child should ever see, the ransacking of homes, the humiliation of villagers, the raw violence that shattered the sense of safety they had known. And yet, even in these moments, their presence reminds us that war touches every generation, that innocence can be disrupted in an instant, and that survival sometimes means enduring memories that last a lifetime. For the adults, the situation was equally harrowing. Villagers who had known one another for decades suddenly found themselves living in fear and suspicion. Every knock at the door, every unfamiliar voice, was a potential threat. Families were separated, with men and women taken for questioning or labor, sometimes never to return. Women and the elderly had to navigate a dangerous landscape where one wrong move could bring devastation. Yet amid the terror, the villagers displayed remarkable resilience. They shared food when supplies were scarce, offered shelter to those in danger, and found small ways to maintain some sense of normalcy, whether it was quietly tending their gardens, helping a neighbor hide, or simply speaking in whispers to maintain morale. The courage wasn't always loud or dramatic, often, it was quiet, everyday bravery that kept people alive, mentally and physically, through unimaginable circumstances. Stories from Poland also highlight the moral complexities that war imposes on ordinary people. Villagers were sometimes forced into impossible decisions, deciding who to protect, who to hide, and when to risk their own safety for someone else. Neighbors who once shared meals now faced the tension of whether to trust each other under the watchful eyes of the occupying forces. Every choice carried weight, and every decision could mean the difference between life and death. It's in these moments that the human side of history becomes vivid, the fear, the hope, the despair, and the resilience all intertwined in ways that statistics or official records can't fully capture. Even amid suffering, the community of Poland found ways to support one another emotionally. Shared grief, whispered prayers, and the quiet solidarity of people facing the same horror became a lifeline. Someone would check on the elderly, another would slip food to a hidden child, and in these small acts of kindness, the villagers found reminders that humanity can endure even in the darkest circumstances. Their stories show us that survival during war isn't just about evading bullets or bombs, it's about holding on to dignity, compassion, and the will to live despite everything around you telling you to despair. The experiences of the people in Poland serve as a lens through which we can understand the broader impact of war on civilians. While generals and historians may focus on strategies and battles, the villagers' perspective reminds us that war's true consequences are deeply personal. It's not abstract, it's visceral. The fear in a mother's eyes, the trembling hands of a man forced to watch his livelihood destroyed, the quiet resilience of a child hiding in a loft, these are the moments that make history tangible, that make the cost of conflict real in ways that statistics never can. By focusing on the human perspective, we see that Poland wasn't just a footnote in the history of World War II, it was a living, breathing community whose very identity was challenged by external forces. The villagers' courage, endurance, and humanity amid the horror of the occupation provide a powerful reminder that even in the face of overwhelming adversity, ordinary people can display extraordinary strength. Their stories deserve to be remembered, not just for what happened to them, but for the resilience and compassion that allowed them to survive and to carry on, long after the soldiers had left their streets empty and scarred. While the shock of what happened in Poland and the personal stories of its villagers capture our attention, it's also essential to understand the broader context, why this seemingly quiet village became a site of such violence and what consequences it left behind. The events in Poland didn't occur in isolation. They were part of a larger pattern of strategy and intimidation during World War II, where occupying forces sought not only to win battles but also to control entire populations through fear. Understanding this context doesn't make what happened any less tragic, but it does help explain how ordinary communities could suddenly find themselves at the mercy of an overwhelming military force. The German occupation of France was systematic and ruthless, designed to suppress resistance, gather resources, and demonstrate dominance. Villages like Polon were often caught in the middle, too small to be strategic military targets, yet too visible to be ignored. Occupying forces wanted to send a message to the surrounding region, that resistance, defiance, or even perceived disobedience would have consequences. The result was a terrifying blend of calculated intimidation and random cruelty. For the villagers, this meant that survival was no longer just about hiding or running, it became about navigating a complex system of rules imposed by outsiders who had little regard for human life or dignity. Every action, every interaction with soldiers, carried the weight of potential danger, and every street, every house, could become a flashpoint of violence. The consequences of these actions extended far beyond the immediate suffering. Families were torn apart, homes destroyed, and a sense of security that had existed for generations was shattered. The physical scars on the village, burned buildings, damaged streets, abandoned homes, were matched by the emotional ones. Survivors carried trauma that lasted long after the occupation ended, and the memory of those days became a defining part of the village's identity. Children who had witnessed violence grew up with stories that shaped their understanding of the world, while adults struggled to reconcile the humanity they had known with the cruelty they had experienced. The legacy of Polon is not just in history books, it lives on in memories, in collective mourning, and in the way communities rebuild after devastation. Polon also serves as a stark example of how local events fit into larger historical forces. The village's experience illustrates the methods used by occupying armies to maintain control, showing that the war wasn't fought solely with guns and tanks, but also through psychological pressure and social disruption. By targeting civilians and everyday life, the occupiers aimed to break not just the physical but the moral and emotional backbone of communities. Resistance, whether large-scale or small acts of defiance, became dangerous but necessary, shaping the culture of survival and solidarity in occupied regions. In this sense, the tragedy of Polon is also a lesson in history. It demonstrates how wars ripple through society, touching ordinary lives in ways that planners and generals could never fully anticipate or quantify. The impact of what happened in Polon didn't stop at the end of the occupation. After the war, the village faced the daunting task of reconstruction, both physically and emotionally. Streets had to be rebuilt, homes repaired, and the social fabric restored. Yet even as buildings were restored, the emotional and psychological effects lingered. People had to learn to trust again, to reclaim public spaces that had been sites of fear, and to rebuild a sense of normalcy for future generations. The village became a symbol of resilience and recovery, a testament to the human ability to endure even when faced with unimaginable hardship. It's a story that reminds us that history isn't only about battles and treaties, it's about the long, often painful process of living through events that seem incomprehensible and coming out on the other side. Finally, the story of Polon emphasizes the importance of memory. Remembering what happened there is not just an act of honoring the past, it's a way of understanding how human communities are affected by war, and why even small, overlooked places matter in the larger narrative of history. The village's experience reminds us that every street, every home, and every person can be caught in the sweep of historical forces, and that ordinary lives can reveal extraordinary truths about courage, suffering, and endurance. In the case of Polon, the consequences of what the Germans did weren't just immediate, they shaped the community, influenced generations, and left a legacy that continues to speak to the human cost of conflict. By connecting the shocking events and personal experiences to this broader historical context, we see a complete picture: the cruelty that struck unexpectedly, the human stories of resilience, and the lasting impact on both the village and history itself. Polon's story is a powerful reminder that history is not abstract, but lived, felt, and remembered, and that understanding these connections allows us to honor the past while learning its lessons for the future.